Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Committee for Workers International live broadcast on CWI Media. I'd like to start by urging all of our viewers to register and support us on our YouTube channel at CWI Media. Now today, of course, we're faced with the dramatic announcement yesterday by Putin that he's going to recognise the two independent republics inside the Ukraine, and there's been incursions by Russian forces into those particular areas. And here today we're going to discuss the implications of those developments globally for Russia, for the Ukraine as well, and of course against the general background of the global crisis of capitalism that we now see face. So today we're having this discussion, Ukraine crisis, a socialist view. We've heard enough from the capitalist media, we've heard enough from Russia Today of the different propaganda from the different elites. So let's discuss these dramatic world events from the standpoint of the working class and from the standpoint of socialists. And maybe we could begin by having a resume of what events have taken place. And maybe Niall Mulholland from the International Secretariet can open our discussion today by giving a resume and a balance sheet of what's taken place so far. Niall.
Well, yes, Tony. I mean, we've seen really dramatic events over the last 24 hours where Putin, with his Security Council, announced that the Russian state was now going to certify or see that the two breakaway republics or enclaves in eastern Ukraine were now independent states and were recognised as such by Russia, and that's Donetsk and Luhansk, the two statelets that have been really in a state of war with Ukraine since 2014. That's immediately been answered with by a series of sanctions by the West, by the United States in particular. They put sanctions against figures in those two breakaway regions. They've also made some sanctions against some of the oligarchs in Russia, and more are expected. In the usual sort of ritualistic fashion, the UN Security Council and the EU have condemned the actions by Putin. And we've also seen it reported that Germany will now pull the plug on the Nord 2 gas pipeline, which is the huge pipeline operation that's just been finished between Russia and Germany. So this is a big departure in the current situation. And to justify the intervention of peacekeeping troops also into these two breakaway areas of eastern Ukraine, Putin has said that there has been attacks by the Ukrainian army against the civilians of Donetsk in particular. Ukraine, he says there's been shelling of civilian infrastructure, including schools, and this has led to the evacuation of tens of thousands of people from that region into Russia, and possibly up to 700,000 refugees or people could be evacuated over the next few days. So we've seen a very quick change in the situation. It's obviously one that's worrying for the working class of eastern Ukraine and Ukraine as a whole, and of course of Russia. And we could see an escalation in the conflict if it's decided by Putin to push on further into Ukrainian territory to try and create a so-called land bridge between the breakaway enclaves and Crimea. That obviously could mean a significant conflict with Ukrainian forces. And although the Russian forces are overwhelming, that would still lead to a high body count, if you like, on both sides. So that's the current situation, Tony, and that's really where things stand at the moment.
Yeah, well, I think that's an accurate assessment of what's taken place thus far. Now, of course, these events don't just drop from the sky, do they? So maybe we could explore a little bit what is reflected in this conflict. We've had this presented as the sort of showdown between Russia, NATO, and the Western forces. They've been desperate to try to pull together some sort of Western alliance against Russia. They've done it to some extent, although it's resulted in all sorts of fracturing and divisions opening up within NATO and within the different powers involved in this particular conflict on the Western side. But then, of course, you see Putin intervene. You see he's cozying up, and the Russians are, with the Chinese regime as well. But what really, Niall, do you think is the root cause of this? What lies behind these developments of this conflict?
I think you need to go back to the collapse of the former Soviet Union in the early 1990s and the dissolution of what was the Soviet Union and the creation of a number of new independent states, including Ukraine. And at that stage, the Russian state, which was being transformed in so-called shock therapy into a capitalist state, really was very weak. The Russian army was demoralized, half starving, not modernized at all. And in that situation, the Western powers were very triumphalist, and they decided to push eastwards, despite the fact that there was a sort of pledged, explicit or implicit, that they wouldn't do so. There'd be an attempt to keep the peace, and that they wouldn't expand eastwards. But that has happened. They've gone into some of the Baltic states. NATO has expanded to the Baltic states, to Poland and other countries. And this has meant that over the last 30 years, NATO has largely had its way and has been lapping up beside Russia. I think the big change has come over the last few years since Russia economically hit rock bottom, but has developed over the last 10 or 15 years, mainly on the basis of the increase of energy prices and because of its huge oil and gas reserves. That's given a lot of new income that has been directed towards the army and the armed forces. So Putin has been able to modernize the Russian army, buy a lot of new equipment, and bring in more conscripts and so on. So it's a very large army now, and it's began to reassert itself, not just regionally but internationally as well. We saw that with the intervention, for example, of Russia into Syria during the conflict there, and just recently into Kazakhstan to hold up into power its client regime. So the balance of forces have changed somewhat. And on the other side, we've seen that the United States and the NATO powers have been relatively weakened. That was explicitly seen in the humiliating way the United States and its allies had to retreat from Afghanistan last year. And I think Putin, in particular, saw this period as his opportunity to really draw a red line in the sand. He's made it absolutely clear that he will not tolerate Ukraine, which is a sort of Russian nationalist. He counts as being part of Russia anyway, historically. But he has made it clear that he would not accept Ukraine becoming part of the NATO alliance. And we saw in 2014, again, where there was developments which went in the favour of the West and NATO powers at that stage. There was a pro-Russian regime that had popular protests against it, but these were overtaken by quite reactionary forces linked to the West, which basically organised a coup against the regime at that time, involving very far-right organisations like the Right Sector and others, and they managed to overthrow that regime and put in place a much more pro-Western regime, much more open to the idea of becoming part of NATO at some point. And really that's whenever the alarm bells began to ring in Moscow. It led to Moscow intervening in Ukraine itself, to annexing Crimea, which is majority Russian-speaking but does have minorities within it, and also to a clash between Russian ethnic speakers, particularly in the east of the country, and the Ukrainian forces, which led to the breakaway enclaves of Donetsk and Luhansk being created in 2014. And by the way, there's been even in a small conflict, we've seen 14,000 people have died since 2014 in the ongoing conflict in the east of the country. But that situation, like I say, changed, and Putin has asserted Russian might, if you like, by bringing his forces to Belarus, by having up to 100,000 troops on the borders of Ukraine. And what we saw in the last few weeks, is, as you mentioned, Tony, is a massive ratcheting up of the propaganda on both sides, NATO funneling arms and support to Ukraine, and really lodged in that situation was something like we saw in the last day or so, when an intervention has now taken place by Russian forces.
So really, I mean, what we have is it's part of a sort of the new geopolitical struggle which is taking place globally. I mean, from the world point of view, the dominant forces have been the struggle between US imperialism, which is in decline, and China, which has been in the ascendancy. And now we see the emergence of this third force of substance, weaker than the other two powers, of course, but nevertheless, this force of Russia, led by under Putin's leadership. And what you say, I think, is important, because you've seen in the recent period, not only in some of the countries the pro-Western governments come into power, but in Brazil, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, pro-Russian governments consolidating their position. And really what Putin seems to be striving to achieve through this is asserting his position, and probably would like to go back to the position that they had prior to the collapse of the former Soviet Union, of try and draw the surrounding countries on Russia's border back into their sphere of influence and orbit in order to strengthen his position. But it is a reflection of the demise, because it is quite striking, with all the bellicose noises coming out of Biden's mouth and everywhere, and Johnson here in Britain as well. When push comes to the shove, they've also made it clear they're not going to put boots on the ground in the Ukraine and get involved in should it escalate into a full-blown conflict, which probably seems a little bit is unlikely. I think that Putin's going to go for an attempt to occupy the whole of the Ukraine. Now, there is another aspect which I think is fundamental here in terms of particularly how socialists view these developments, and that is, of course, the national aspirations and democratic rights of different peoples involved in this particular conflict. There's the right of the Ukrainian peoples, there's the right of the Russian population, there's the right of the populations in the two provinces you refer to, which are Russian dominated. So maybe, Niall, you could outline a little bit, what is the approach of socialists towards the national question as far as this issue is concerned? And maybe we could touch upon a little point, we can come and develop this point a little bit later, because Putin has invoked Lenin in order to defend his position. Or he's not invoked Lenin to justify Lenin's position, he's blaming Lenin for the current situation which exists. In fact, he said it's wrong to refer to Ukraine as Ukraine. It should be referred to and dubbed as Vladimir Lenin's Ukraine. Everything's offloaded on poor old Vladimir, despite his policies being entirely different to Putin and Stalin, etc. But maybe we could touch and discuss some of these developments as well, which are fundamental for socialists in terms of not only analysing the situation, but also what policy and programme we put forward on these issues. So maybe Niall, I'd like to develop a few points around that.
Yeah, I mean, Putin in his address, his televised address, when he justified the intervention yesterday and putting peacekeeping troops, as you said, Tony, so-called, into that part of eastern Ukraine, he made a long address, which is not entirely coherent, but it invoked a lot of the early years of the Soviet Union, and he's particularly critical of Lenin. He also mixes up Lenin's position and Stalin's position as two very separate things. But he's very critical of Lenin, who he blames for having given too much leeway to nationalists and therefore allowing the creation of separate republics at the start of the Soviet Union, and really that this has set a time bomb of nationalism that has to be combated. And he prefaces these remarks, Putin does, by saying how long, the Russians and the Ukrainians have more or less been the same people, the same Christian peoples, and so on. And obviously, it's a complicated history. It's been different movements of peoples and so on over many generations. But it's ridiculous to say there's not such a thing as a Ukrainian national consciousness. And Lenin understood that in 1917. And the point we would always make is that the Russian Revolution would never have been successful if the Bolsheviks didn't have a very sensitive program on the national question alongside their other demands as part of a general socialist program. And Lenin made the point that socialists can give no hint whatsoever of coercion of national minorities and national groups. And if they hadn't put forward the position in 1917 of the right of nations oppressed under Tsarism, of their right to have self-determination, including and up to independence, then you could not have won over the masses. But Lenin went further than that, because he also said that after separation should come federation. And the Soviet Union was a union of different socialist republics, including Ukraine. And the idea was at that time that they would rule on the basis of equal treatment, and it would be a voluntary federation. And that was the position in the early years of the Soviet Union under Lenin and Trotsky and the Bolsheviks and the Bolshevik program. It's a very different situation under Stalin, which Putin just completely mixes up with Lenin's position. Under Stalin, of course, we saw massive oppression of the national minorities, particularly in Ukraine, where disastrous economic policies alongside national oppression led to widespread famine. It led to the deportation of big numbers of the population. So it led to a very deep sense of injustice and resentment amongst the people of Ukraine. And over time, of course, this led to a situation of new demands for a separation and so on. And all this was compounded then in 1991 by the breakup of the Soviet Union, and that was done on the basis of capitalism. The breakup was done on the basis of lots of former top bureaucrats becoming capitalists, looting the economy, and to give themselves some sort of social position in society, they whipped up and exploited national divisions, set workers against each other, and Ukraine was part of this process as well. And Putin and his entourage were all part of that process, that bloody process that developed not just in the former Soviet Union, but particularly in countries like the ex-Yugoslavia. So that's the real background to what's actually happened. Not the way that the way Putin has traduced and attacked Lenin over the last 24 hours.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible the way that Putin has responded. Of course, we should emphasize here the sheer and utter hypocrisy of the propaganda we've had from the West, who've been denouncing the Russians for having fake flags being used as a justification for intervention, which may or may not be true. Quite possibly is true, but nevertheless, what hypocrisy. What about the West's record on that? Weapons of mass destruction in Iraq is something that maybe would spring to mind as well, as at least. And of course, there's a whole history of utter hypocrisy as far as the West is concerned. But the issue of the democratic rights is crucial, because I think, as you correctly said, Niall, it's absurd to deny the fact there is a Ukrainian national consciousness which exists, and of course the peoples of the Ukraine have their rights to independence should they want it. But it is, of course, on the other side, where you have the Russian speakers in these two areas, and maybe more, that they would have their own democratic rights as well. The right to autonomy, should they want it, and the right to secession, should they want it. Putin, in his address, featured heavily on the economic issues as far as the national oppression is concerned. But of course, the right to self-determination that was defended by Lenin also went beyond the economic interest. It was a question of the defense of language, of cultural rights. All of that is fundamental to defending the rights of oppressed minorities. And of course, from that point of view, any decision by the independent Russian areas in the Ukraine, they have the democratic right to decide what they wanted, but not on the basis of being held under the bayonets of the Russian occupying forces. But I mean, it's the rights of all of those people. Now, it is interesting, the points you made, and I think it's fundamental to see the changes that can take place, that did take place historically, because the point you made, Niall, about what happened in the Russian Revolution, I think, was crucial, because Lenin's position for the right of self-determination up to the point of independence in effect meant, as the Ukraine joined the Socialist Federation, the movement came together for a period. As a process of integration took place. Now, Trotsky made in a marvellous piece, which I think we'd encourage people to read, on the questions of the Ukraine in 1939, marked the difference in the situation, because what you had was the movement was brought together in a process of integration during and after the revolution itself. By the time you get to the Stalinist era, exactly the opposite had taken place. You had the Stalinist bureaucracy taking place. As Trotsky made the point in this article, Ukraine suffered one of the worst aspects of the purges that were implemented by Stalin. And that gave a further boost to separatist sentiments and move for independence. And in that situation, as part of the struggle against the Soviet bureaucracy, the Stalinist bureaucracy, Trotsky then advocated an independent Ukraine on the basis of a workers' government, not capitalist restoration, as part of the process of the overthrow of the Stalinist bureaucracy. And following that, the linking together with the workers of Russia, hopefully the movement will come back together. Now, of course, all of that was against the background of the isolation of the Russian Revolution. But all of those issues have now come back onto the debate on the basis of what has taken place now. So we're faced with this crisis, and the key question now is, what is the view of socialists in terms of how to respond to this crisis? What programme and demands do we think should be advocated to defend the interests of working people on both sides of the conflict at this stage? So maybe, Niall, you'd like to outline a few points in relation to how events may develop and the issue of what programme the Committee for Workers International would advocate on these questions.
Yeah, and I think the issues of the right to self-determination and the overall social and economic programme we put forward are completely interlinked in this situation. Putin has really shown himself to be an exponent of great Russian chauvinism. It's an echo of Stalin. It's an echo of the Tsar. I'll just give you a quote from his speech yesterday. This is how he refers to the programme of Lenin and Trotsky and the Bolsheviks on the right of self-determination. He calls it an odious and utopian fantasies inspired by the revolution, which are absolutely destructive for any normal state. And of course, what he means by a normal state is a capitalist state. I mean, he runs an oligarchic capitalist gangster state. It's a bit unusual because of its history, but it's still capitalism. And that's what he puts forward. On the other hand, of course, self-determination out of the mouths of the likes of NATO has to be looked at as well. They have been calling for the right of self-determination for Ukraine over the last few months in this crisis. What they mean is the right of Ukraine, so-called, to join NATO, to join their war machine, to be part of the NATO imperialist alliance, which we should remember was the force which intervened in Libya. It's the force that has intervened in countless aggressive measures against smaller nations in the interests of imperialism. And as you said, Tony, there's all sorts of hypocrisy coming out of the mouths of Western leaders at the present time. From our point of view, from the point of view of the CWI and Marxists, we put forward an independent socialist programme for workers in that region, and we do so as far as the national question is concerned as well. We're against any coercion or repression of any national grouping or minority, and we do stand for the right of self-determination for national groups. And we had to be concrete about what does that actually mean. In the case of Ukraine today, we do say we're opposed to intimidation by hundreds of thousands of Russian troops on their borders. But on the other hand, that means giving no succour whatsoever, no support whatsoever to NATO or to the regime in Kiev. On the other hand, we'd say that the breakaway enclaves of Donetsk and Luhansk in East Ukraine also deserve their right to self-determination. Now, some people have argued, but they're tiny. How's that viable? They're just tiny little strips of land. But that, as Lenin pointed out, isn't the crucial issue when you talk about the right of self-determination. Even a city can have a special status, can be an open city, for example, between different peoples in a socialist society where there's been disputes, territorial disputes in the past. And in the case of Eastern Ukraine, we do support the right of those peoples who obviously do not want to live in Ukraine, would feel oppressed, discriminated, would face a terrible situation if they're under the rule of capitalism in Ukraine, and they want to have their own separate rule. But we also have to warn that they will find no salvation whatsoever under Putin and under the rule of the oligarchs in Moscow. If anything, what the situation has proven since 2014 is that they're just the playthings of Moscow in this situation, where, as I said, 14,000 people have died. The people of those two enclaves are completely impoverished. They are now in a desperate situation where they're having to flee their homelands, up to 700,000 of them possibly. And what sort of conditions and rights will they have in Russia when they get there? Just as the people of the Crimea have also been quite loudly complaining, actually, over the last number of years that the much vaunted change in conditions they would get when Crimea became part of Russia hasn't happened. And they also live in poverty, many of them, and have no real rights and conditions. So we do support the right to self-determination for peoples, but we always link that to the need to change society fundamentally and for the unity of the working class. And we'd still hold by Lenin's position, anywhere in the world actually, that whenever self-determination is exercised democratically and people decide to go independent, that is their right. But as socialists, we'd always advocate that they should link up as part of a federation on an equal and voluntary basis. And certainly you can't have genuine self-determination at the end of bayonets, be they from Russia or be they from NATO. And therefore it's necessary for the working class of the region to build its own independent class organisations. That means genuine independent trade unions that will take on the bosses and the oligarchs. And it means political parties. That means building socialist parties which have a programme that is based on the programme that Lenin and Trotsky and the Bolsheviks put forward 100 years ago. And of course, that's not an easy task. It's a very dire situation in Ukraine at the present time. It's difficult for the masses in Russia as well. The economies in both places are in difficulties. Living standards have plummeted. It's not easy when there's not already, even in many cases, even a rudimentary trade unions of an independent character in existence. So it's not easy, but it's the only steps forward, because the alternatives are what we have now, of endless poverty, endless crisis and tensions, and then conflicts breaking out in a big way every so often, every few years, leading to many deaths and destruction. And that's the period we're beginning to enter again, sadly, in this situation. And that's why it's absolutely necessary, and it will be done by the workers in that region. I'm absolutely confident that they will build their own class organisations to find a way out of this crisis.
I think that's a very good summary of the sort of programme that's necessary. And of course, one of the factors for Putin at this stage is not only is striving to increase his sphere of influence on the world stage, he's also probably using this as a means of whipping up Russian nationalism, or attempting to do it, partly because of the pressure he's beginning to feel at home with the declining support for his him and his regime, is another factor and an element that we have to do it. Exactly how this conflict pans out, of course, is far from certain. It's not likely, I think, we couldn't rule it out, but it's not likely that Russia will go for a full-blown intervention through the whole of the Ukraine. You may end up with them trying to push further forward, establish this corridor down to the Crimea, which is a strong possibility. It may mean that you have the development of some sort of guerrilla conflict against Russian forces from Ukrainian-backed forces as well, supported by the West. But we have to see how the development unfolds in the next period. But it is definitely a reflection of the depth of the crisis that faces global capitalism and imperialism at this stage, and it's a measure of the new situation that we're in. So we hope that you've enjoyed this discussion that we've had on this crisis in Ukraine. You've heard the position of the CWI in defense of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin against Putin's attacks on him, in defense of the best traditions of the Bolshevism and the Russian Revolution. So we'll be back on CWI Media in future to discuss other international and global developments. In the meantime, if you want to read more about our analysis on the Ukraine or the international situation or struggles in different parts of the world, we'd encourage you to go to our website on socialistworld.net. If you're now able to, if you're a Spanish speaker or reader, you can read our Spanish language website, mundosocialista.net, which is there as well now. So we wish all the comrades well in their own struggles. We'd appeal to our non-members who are watching to join us in the Committee for Workers International, details of which you can find on our website on socialistworld.net. So thanks for joining us and viewing this important discussion on this crisis which is unfolding.